Sometimes after a long project like the T14, I don't know about you, but I feel like I need a small, easy model to get me excited about building again. A palette cleanser, if you will. Since the T14 took nearly 3 years to complete, yeah, my palette needs a little cleansing. We're going to be doing something very different from the normal 1/35th scale tanks of the channel, and trust me, we'll be returning to those guys soon, but I want to try my hand at aircraft modeling for a change. This part of the hobby has always interested me with their sleek lines, detailed cockpits, and silvery weathered surfaces, so let's see how an armor modeler does with a 1/72nd aircraft kit. As you probably saw in the thumbnail, we'll be building the Eduard Spitfire Mk.IX.C in 1/72nd scale. I was drawn to this kit due to its high level of detail with all the rivets molded in, and Eduard's generally good quality. I also chose a Profi Pack set since that included a small set of printed photo etch and a masking set. The construction is super straightforward and hassle-free. All the parts fit super well and were surprisingly detailed. There are very few small seam lines, but otherwise cleanup was minimal. 99.9% of this build is completely out of the box, but I had to add a few wires in just to satisfy my own customization itch. I actually pulled these from an old DC motor, and they're the thinnest wires I've ever been able to find. I didn't put every wire that exists in the real life cockpit into this one, since there's seriously a ton, but I put in the ones I thought would be visible. Oh, and if you like this content, make sure to go follow me over on Instagram at The Scale Engineer. We're just starting it out, but there's a bunch of stuff I post on there all the time about my current projects. Once the cockpit construction was finished, I based all the components in Tamiya LP70 gloss aluminum. This is one of the first lacquer paints I've used on my models, but it's super robust and has a decent enough metallic finish for some basic hairspray chipping effects. I found that I had to lay it down in semi-wet layers so that the metallic flakes could flow and homogenize into the proper metallic sheen. If you just spray on a dry coat, the paint will look too flaky since the flakes can't flow on the surface the way they're designed to. You know, the really metallic sheen on the top of the paint in the bottle? Yeah, that's what we're going for. I then followed that up with a coat of hairspray. I'm not the best at getting this layer the proper coverage, but I've found decanting it into the airbrush cap helps a lot. Once that dried, I finally added the cockpit color with Tamiya XF71, which says it's for IJN cockpits, but it's also basically the exact same as the British cockpit color. I also experimented with a little shading by adding buff to the base coat and then shadowing with some Tamiya smoke, but I didn't find it super effective, so we'll explore that on the next plane a little bit more. Once all the layers are dried, I could start chipping through the base color. This technique is super easy if you did it right, which thankfully I did this time. I used a flat brush with some water to reactivate the chipping layer and lift the top coat, creating really fine chips, mostly on edges and raised surfaces where abrasion would normally happen. After painting some of the details with Vallejo acrylics, I decided to experiment a little. Recently, I received some of these really neat decals from Tom Annis. If you haven't heard of Annis decals yet, well, have you been living under a rock? These decals caught my eye before I actually even started on this project because they seem so useful and versatile. They're basically really teeny tiny placards, stenciling, pinstriping, and more. He also sells a bunch of 3D files that are great for detailing 1/48th and 1/32nd scale aircraft, like dials, knobs, and stuff like that. Seriously, you should go take a look. These things are really cool, and did I mention they're printed by Cartograph? Yeah, they are, and so they lay down perfectly and are super easy to work with. If you decide you want to try them out for yourself, which I highly recommend, use the code ENGINEER2024 for a nice 10% off your order. Links to his website are in the description below. And in the spirit of transparency, guys, Tom didn't pay me to say any of that. I don't even know if he knows I'm doing this little segment. He did send me the product to review, and I do get a little back if you guys use the link below, but I genuinely do love this product, and I'm so glad I can give you guys a little discount for your own hobby adventures. To help add some contrast and grime to the black and aluminum surfaces, I used Apothecary White and Basilicanum Gray Citadel contrast paints. These are water-soluble solutions, washes of sorts, that are super easy to implement and are basically bulletproof once they dry. After that, I did a little oil paint rendering to add some color variation to the interior green, followed up by a basic pin wash. And if anyone watching isn't familiar with a pin wash, it's basically just a super thinned down oil paint mixture that you wash into all the recesses and edges and everything like that, and then you clean it out of everywhere except those places, and it makes it really grimy and dirty and highlights those edges. It's a really easy way to make your models pop. The printed photo etch instrument panel is another huge pro of the Profi Pack kit. All you have to use is a little CA glue to glue the layers together, and then use a little clear gloss to add the glass instrument covers. Oops, almost forgot the photo etch seatbelts. And with that, I glued it up and realized all the work is basically invisible. On the bright side, the two fuselage halves go together really well. Obviously there was a little bit of sanding necessary since those panels shouldn't have a seam down the center, but other than that it was super easy to get these pieces together and really fit nicely. One of the great things about plane kits, especially small World War II ones like this, is once you have the fuselage halves together, you're basically done with the build. Just gotta attach the wings, tail, and the canopy along with a few odds and ends. The masking kit that comes with this set is so handy. I wish all plane kits came with this because this makes it so much easier to deal with these little clear parts that are a huge pain in the butt. Also, the tweezers you're seeing me use in pretty much all of my shots are the Annis needle nose tweezers. They're literally the best tweezers I have ever used, and I highly recommend picking up a set. Finally, I cleaned it off with isopropyl alcohol and the spit was ready to be primed. Alright, so to make sure that the silver paint looked as good as possible, I primed it with Tamiya X1 Gloss Black. Also, my airbrush was sputtering a little bit while I was doing this. I'm not sure if that was because I didn't have a moisture trap on it or if it was just some kind of clog in the airbrush itself, but I cleaned it out and then put a moisture trap on there and it fixed everything. The black paint also revealed some imperfections, so I corrected those before moving on. This little rivet roller tool was super useful to recreate the awesome original rivet patterns on the surface after sanding. All you do is line up the teeth with the original surviving pattern, roll it across, maintaining a little pressure so the tool properly cuts into the plastic. Then, you just sand the surface lightly so it's all flush and you're back in business. Even if you're not planning on riveting a whole wing of an aircraft or anything like that, I'd say this tool is actually still pretty useful for anyone who uses it on a modern plastic kit, since those usually do have rivets, and being able to recreate those after sanding and cleaning up surfaces is really, really helpful. I have a set of 1/72 ones and then also a set of 1/48 scale ones, because we may be doing a kit in the future where I'm going to be doing the entire rivet pattern from scratch, which is going to be really cool. With that, I reprimed the sanded section and then laid down a couple thin coats of Tamiya LP11 silver. And just like the cockpit, I put down a layer of hairspray chipping fluid down on all the surfaces I planned on chipping later. And now we can start getting the base colors down. And I'm not gonna lie, but this took way longer than I expected and took so much masking. And yeah, I know all you aircraft modelers out there are going, well, yeah, duh. But for an armor modeler who's used to a max of 3 colors on a single subject, 7 colors just for the base coat felt pretty dang extreme. I started by blocking out the main camo colors, starting with a Tamiya XF82 Ocean Grey 2, which was nearly a perfect match to the original color. I didn't have to worry too much about this coat since we'll be masking and cleaning up the shapes in a second here, but I didn't want to cover over the aluminum too much. I really wanted to try some airbrush post shading because I saw all these little rivet panels that are made in the surface and I wanted to highlight each of those, but I was having trouble getting my airbrush to paint that small. I think it was just I hadn't cleaned my airbrush enough or something like that. And so I wasn't having a ton of luck with that. I think on the next project I'll try a bit more, but for this one it wasn't really visible, and so I tried to supplement it later with some oil paints and stuff like that. Once that coat was down, I used blue tack rolled in small noodles to mark out the edges of the camo colors, mostly because I was too afraid to try to freehand it myself. I also learned the hard way that just the noodles themselves aren't going to protect the paint very much, and so I covered everything in masking tape after a little bit of an overspray mishap beforehand. But now that that's on, I can use Tamiya XF81 Dark Green 2 to complete the upper surface's camo. Once that's had a chance to dry, we can peel off the masking. And I'll just let you enjoy that process for a moment. After hours of masking, this is such a good feeling. And while I'm doing that, if you guys are new to the channel, be sure to subscribe and like the video as it helps me out a ton. And the next project's going to be pretty awesome, so you don't want to miss it. In fact, my Patreon supporters already know what we're going to be doing, so if you want to see what's coming ahead of time and get a bunch of cool perks like 1 week early ad-free videos, benchtop updates, and pretty soon Patreon exclusive content and interactive courses, go check it out for as little as $1 a month. Anyways, back to your regularly scheduled programming. Alright, now that the paint's fresh, we can start chipping the wing walks and the cowling to start the weathering process. I started this by using a 2000 grit sanding sponge to lightly thin the main base colors and help the silver paint shine through. As you can see, this is pretty dang easy to overdo, and I definitely overdid it in a few places, but I fixed that in later steps. I followed up the sanding sponge with just a flat brush moistened with water, which reactivated the chipping fluid and created some really nice chips. It went a little overboard, and so I repainted some of the surface and chipped it back down for a more subtle look. After a little more masking, I used Tamiya XF83 for the underside, focusing the paint in the center of the panel so that the panel lines would be sort of shaded, helping with the next weathering effects. The invasion stripes were the most difficult section for me. I believe that the standard for these stripes was that they were supposed to be 18 inches wide each, which in 1/72nd scale translates to a quarter inch each, which is super nice and easy to measure out. The masking, however, was a bit more challenging. I used some flexible Tamiya masking tape that has the same consistency as electrical tape. It's just cut into really fine strips, which makes it perfect for this process. I started by blocking out the white color first, as it would be easier to spray black over white instead of the other way around. After another 2 hours of masking, I sprayed on the black stripes. They're not as consistent as I'd like, but it's alright. These were generally painted by hand, and so a little unevenness on the undersurface of this Spitfire isn't the end of the world. After that, I added the yellow running edges and propeller blade tips. Finally, I added the pastel green band on the tail and the propeller nose cone. Next, I decided I wanted to try out some contrast paints applied with a sponge. This added some really interesting textures similar to how some aircraft modelers spray lighter and darker shades through a textured screen to add random splotches to the surface. I think it worked pretty well here, although in the future I'm going to use slightly less extreme contrasting colors. A general application of the contrast paint helped tone down the splotches. After a varnish gloss coat, I could start on the decals. There are so many teeny tiny decals, like way more than I was expecting, but despite horror stories that I've heard about Eduard decals, Tamiya Mark Fit made them conform perfectly to all the surface details of the model. I kept track of the decals I'd applied by checking them off on the color callout. My application process for the decals was pretty simple and ranged for all of them from the smallest ones to the very largest roundels. I soaked them in hot water until the backing paper was saturated, and then I let them sit on a paper towel until the decal came loose. After that, I applied it with some tweezers and then tamped it down with Mark Fit and a Q-tip, just like you can see here. Some of the harder spots on the raised bumps I used a toothpick for, but really it didn't need that very often. Some of the decals cracked while conforming over raised details on the wing and undersides, so I fixed that with a little intermediate blue Vallejo acrylic paint. Alright, chipping time. This part I'm actually really proud of since I'm not the best at chipping usually, but this time since the target surface was so small and so detailed it made it really easy to pick out and achieve the result I wanted. I'm using a 10/0 Russian sable brush and making sure that there's barely any paint on the brush as I work, focusing the effect around the edges of the panels along rivet lines and on exposed edges or places where the crew would walk. Using this in conjunction with hairspray chipping, supplementing the existing chipping, made it really easy and intuitive, and it gave it a really complex, interesting looking finish. Another benefit to doing it this way is that you can remove any mistakes you make with a toothpick. Here you can kind of see the before and after of the chipping results after I refine it from the hairspray chipping, and it looks so much better. You may be wondering why I'm doing so much heavy chipping on this model, and the reason is as I was researching this, Pinterest is an amazing place to research for historical photos if you didn't already know that, but the reason I'm doing it is because I saw all these photos of really beaten up Spitfires that are just absolutely destroyed by the end of the war on these historical photos, and so I'm trying to recreate that because I think it makes the thing look more interesting. I've never been one for really subtle weathering, and so this is a great way to get some of that into a plane model and work in my comfort zone in that way. Also, if you couldn't tell, I had a ton of fun chipping this surface. For some reason, it was just really working well for me, and I got these results that I wasn't even expecting that are super fine and detailed. It helped homogenize the decals into the surface, helped kind of tell a story of weathering and age and wear on this vehicle. And it was so much fun to think about where these chips are going to go over the duty of the aircraft and how it's going to look most realistic and everything like that, and really just tie together the paint scheme under this weathered surface. Oh, and I used my hand to remove the excess paint from the brush before applying it to the model, which is why it looks like a 5-year-old drew all over it. Next up, I used a mix of Van Dyke Brown, Azo Yellow Green, and Lamp Black to create a greasy looking oil pin wash. However, while I was applying this all to the awesome details on this thing, I had a bit of an epiphany, which we'll talk about in a moment. The pin wash was pretty much the usual procedure, however. Apply darker paint, usually enamel or oil, to pin lines and details to add a shadow effect and make them pop. Once dry, we remove the excess with a brush dampened in mineral spirits. Okay, so what's this huge epiphany you had, you may ask? Well, it's really not anything huge, but I realized that this wash was the perfect color and composition to simulate accumulated grease and grime on the upper surfaces of the plane. And so not only did I just highlight raised edges and panel lines and rivets and stuff, but I also used it as a grime pass, leaving streaks of grime wherever it made sense. Access hatches, walkways, rivet lines, and stuff like that. As you can see, it can be applied more generally, allowed to dry, and then blended and shaped however you want it to look in the end. The underside of the aircraft just received a basic sludge wash of the oil paint since it was going to be a lot less visible. I don't really plan on putting this thing on a mirror. Nearing the end of the process now, I painted some of the smaller details I'd neglected at first, like the landing gear, the canopy, and a couple other small details. I also tried my hand at painting plane exhausts, which were fun since they're a lot more complex than what I'm used to. I started with just a basic dark gray coat, which I followed with some uneven off-white applied in basically the same way I did the chipping on the wings. To tone down the contrast and keep the exhausts dark, I covered the whole thing in a dark gray contrast paint. After that, I gave it a light rust wash and painted the ends with Tamiya XF1 flat black, and they were done. To finish up the weathering on the plane itself, I painted in exhaust staining behind the exhausts, mirroring what I'd seen in historic photos. It really surprised me how filthy these planes really do get. I started with a deck tan soot outline, and I forgot to film it, but I painted in a darker streak down the middle after that. I used some black oil paint to make the effect a little more uneven and realistic looking, and that was it. To help make the Spitfire look really worn and used, I finalized the weathering effects on the wings with some dust enamels blended over the wing walks. This took a couple minutes just getting everything blended smoothly. I used a bunch of different kinds of brushes. I really like using round brushes for my blending surfaces. but you can use whatever you're comfortable with. I mention this almost every time I'm talking about dust effects, but these take a surprisingly long amount of time to get right. So just be patient with them and keep blending until you're satisfied with the result. Also remember that once it dries, it'll be a little bit more subtle as it'll go matte and blend into the surface a bit better. All that was left to do was to finish the weathering on the undersurfaces, which started with some Hasegawa mirror foil for the landing gear shock absorbers. This stuff can be kind of a pain to work with, but you measure out your pieces beforehand and work slowly, and they go on without too much issue. Now, Spitfires are notoriously leaky, and there's several good photos online of the bottom of these things just covered in oil and grease and grime from the engine bay. So I tried to recreate that as best as I could, with different oil paint colors streaked down the center of the lower fuselage. This is a pretty simple effect, just make sure to blend the streak from both sides as this will give it the most even and realistic looking streaks. As you can see, I'm using a combination of speckling and streaking effects to get the most realistic look possible. This is all up to your own opinion though, so if you don't like how messy this looks, or if you think it should look more messy, that's all up to you and you can do that on your own model. I followed that up with some speckling with the same grime wash I used for the upper surfaces, and I think that the overall effect looks pretty dang good if I do say so myself. Alright, and with that, I attached all the little parts that I'd kept separate for the build, and I call this project done. Well guys, I am super happy with how this project came out. I don't usually do aircraft, and so this was a welcome change from the usual stuff. It pushed my skills in a different direction that I think I'll be taking back to the armor side of things. Also, another huge thank you to Tom Annis for sending me those sweet decals. I have some more kits in the future that I want to use those for. That should be pretty dang cool. Again, if you want to get your hands on those, use my link in the description, use code ENGINEER2024 for an additional 10% off. If you haven't subscribed already, be sure to do that because I think the next project is going to be a fun one. We're headed back to a World War II tank and one that was sort of requested on the channel at the end of my T14 project, so hopefully you guys stick around for that. With that, I want to extend a huge thank you to my Patreon supporters, and I'll see you next time.